50,000 Romans roar as the gates crash open. What begins is not a trial of justice, but a performance of pain. Rome's glory was not paid in coins, it was purchased in blood, in screams in bodies cast to beasts, who truly bore the cost of the empire's entertainment. Chronicles celebrate triumphs. Archaeology and eyewitnesses reveal what the law tried to disguise. If you value the historical record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. The sand of the Colosseum was never clean. Each new day began with blood already soaked deep into its grains, memories of the condemned who had stood trembling before the crowd. To Romans, executions were not hidden punishments. They were spectacles, civic rituals that merged religion, law, and entertainment into one. A condemned man, clad in nothing but a rough loincloth, would be pushed into the arena, blinking against the blinding sunlight. The audience, packed into tiered marble seats, leaned forward, their eyes hungry for what came next. From the opposite gate, the growl of a caged lion echoed. With the pull of a lever, the beast surged into daylight, released not merely to kill, but to perform. This was damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, a punishment most often reserved for slaves, foreigners, and those who had betrayed Rome. The law named it justice. The people called it spectacle. The emperor called it power. Together, these voices turned death into a performance scripted by the state. Rome's spectacles did not happen by accident. They were scheduled, planned, and institutionalized into the very rhythm of civic life. If the roar of the arena was the heartbeat of empire, then emperors ensured that heartbeat never stopped. Entertainment became governance. Cruelty became calendar. Augustus was the first to grasp this fully. As he refashioned Rome from republic to empire, he understood that stability depended not only on legions and laws, but on public morale. So, he embedded games into the civic year, assigning specific days for spectacles that blended gladiatorial combat, animal hunts, and executions. By the 1st century CE, the calendar was thick with such entertainments. By the 4th century, over 135 days each year were devoted to public games. That is more than 1 day in 3, when Romans gathered not for politics or worship, but for blood and amusement. The games were structured like theatre. Lighter amusements opened the morning acrobats' displays of exotic animals' comic skits. At midday came the executions staged with deliberate cruelty, when the sun was hottest and shadows sharpest, maximizing both discomfort for the condemned and spectacle for the audience. The afternoon climaxed with gladiatorial duels, more prestigious and skillful, ensuring that the day ended, not with disgust, but with exhilaration. In this way, the empire paced emotion, laughter, horror, awe, woven into civic ritual. The inauguration of the Colosseum under Titus in 80 CE exemplified this structure. For 100 consecutive days, the empire staged spectacles so vast that they redefined what Roman entertainment meant. Thousands of criminals and captives were killed. Animals from the farthest provinces, lions, crocodiles, elephants, even ostriches were paraded and slaughtered. Martial, the court poet, commemorated these games in verses that glorified both the spectacle and the emperor. But behind the poetry lay a calculation. Rome displayed its global reach, its resources, and its willingness to expend life for spectacle. Executions were not fillers, they were punctuation marks. Slotted between shows, they reminded the audience of hierarchy. Even in entertainment law was visible. A criminal might be burned beheaded or fed to beasts not only to eliminate him, but to signal that Roman order extended into leisure. The people cheered not because they loved cruelty for its own sake, but because cruelty became part of belonging. To attend was to affirm citizenship. Juvenal's phrase, panem et circenses, bread and circuses, captures this reality. The state distributed grain to the poor and blood to the crowds. Both fed survival. Both fed loyalty. So long as the people were given spectacle, they were less likely to question corruption, tyranny, or the erosion of political freedom. In a sense, the amphitheatre became Rome's parliament of distraction. Decisions made in the Senate mattered less to the populace than the next round of games. Seneca's testimony adds another dimension. He admitted that the games corrupted him, that he returned home more ambitious, more cruel after watching. His confession reveals what emperors exploited cruelty was contagious. By normalizing blood as entertainment, the state fostered acceptance of its harshest laws. Citizens who cheered at the Colosseum would not flinch at crucifixions on the roadside or mass executions after revolts. Entertainment became moral conditioning. The architecture itself embodied this fusion of power and spectacle. The Colosseum, capable of holding 50,000 spectators, was a monument to both engineering and propaganda. Its hypogeum, 2 subterranean levels of cages, lifts, and trapdoors, allowed animals and prisoners to emerge as if by magic, heightening suspense. Emperors sat in reserved boxes, their gestures determining life or death. In those moments, the crowd saw imperial power dramatized Caesar as arbiter of fates, echoing the gods themselves. Yet, these spectacles were not free. They demanded staggering resources, money for construction, food for animals, guards for prisoners, actors to reenact myths, and of course, the endless supply of the condemned. The cost was immense, but emperors saw it as investment. Bread kept bodies alive. Circuses kept minds obedient. Together, they purchased loyalty cheaper than civil war. And so cruelty was institutionalized, not hidden in corners, but broadcast to tens of thousands. Games became the stage where empire performed itself. Power enthroned justice, dramatized death, aestheticized. Each scheduled day reinforced the message Rome is eternal, because Rome controls life, death, and spectacle. Of all the punishments staged in Rome's arenas, none captured the imagination more fully than damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. The very phrase conjures terror, for it was not just death, but death converted into theatre. It was less about justice than choreography, a ritual in which human lives became props in a script written for mass entertainment. The mechanics were deceptively simple. A condemned man or woman, stripped to the barest clothing, was led into the arena. A trapdoor opened. From the darkness below, lions, leopards, or bears burst forth. The end was inevitable. Yet, what made the punishment memorable was not inevitability, but performance. Emperors and organizers designed these executions to be stories. The condemned were often dressed as figures from mythology, forced to reenact legends with grotesque endings. A criminal might be arrayed as Hercules handed nothing but a wooden club and set against a starving lion. In the myth, Hercules triumphed through strength and cunning. In the arena, the man stood no chance. His failure underscored Rome's supremacy, rewriting myth as mockery. Another victim might be dressed as Icarus, fitted with crude wings, and pushed from a platform only to be mauled by beasts as soon as he struck the ground. Myth became blood parody. One of the most chilling accounts involves Nero, who revelled in these theatrical cruelties. According to Suetonius, he once forced a condemned man to impersonate Daedalus, the craftsman of the labyrinth. The man was fitted with wings and ordered to fly from a high scaffold. Instead, he plummeted and burst apart before the emperor's box, splattering blood onto spectators. The symbolism was clear in Nero's Rome. Even ingenuity was punished, and myth itself bent to imperial cruelty. Equally grotesque was the spectacle of Orpheus. In legend, the musician's lyre could charm beasts and even persuade Hades. In the arena, a condemned man was given a lyre and told his music might tame the lions. For a fleeting moment, the animals appeared, calmed, circling in silence as the notes drifted. Then, as if cued by some darker force, they leapt, ripping the man apart. The crowd roared approval, as the poet martial quipped, "What was fable on the stage become truth in our arena." It was myth inverted art, undone by savagery. Why did Romans crave such pageantry? Partly because myth was cultural glue. To witness familiar stories restaged in flesh was to participate in shared identity. Yet the brutality added a second layer. It reminded spectators that Rome was stronger than gods' legends or foreigners. By humiliating myth, the state affirmed its own supremacy. The logistics of these spectacles were staggering. Venatores, specialized hunters, ranged across the empire, capturing wild beasts for shipment to Rome. From the forests of Germania came bears and boars. From the deserts of Africa, lions and leopards. From India, rhinoceroses and tigers. The journey itself killed many, but enough survived to astonish crowds with Rome's reach. To watch an African lion devour a prisoner in Rome was to feel the empire's geography condensed into theatre. Every corner of the known world was harnessed to feed the Colosseum's appetite. Seneca, disgusted, described how these games reduced both victim and viewer. "I come home more greedy, more ambitious, more cruel." His words suggest a society addicted to spectacle, one where compassion was eroded by repeated exposure to suffering. Yet he too attended proof of how irresistible the games were even to those who despised them. What is most striking is the transformation of punishment into ritual. In earlier eras, executions were swift and solemn, aimed at removing criminals. By the imperial period, they had become entertainment blocks slotted into the schedule. Noon was death's hour, a grim interlude between comedy and gladiatorial combat. In this arrangement, damnatio ad bestias functioned like a grotesque chorus in the drama of the day. The symbolism extended beyond myth. To be thrown to beasts was to be declared less than human fit only for consumption. Slaves. Foreigners and enemies of the state were most often selected. Thus, the punishment reinforced social hierarchy. The citizen watched the emperor presided, the criminal perished. Each role was clear. Each death reaffirmed Rome's order. Even poets who might have critiqued often joined the chorus of approval. Martial praised the inventiveness of the spectacles, marveling at how fable became flesh. His verses celebrated not the condemned, but the artistry of execution. Through such praise, cruelty was enshrined as culture. Yet traces of unease remained. Some writers noted moments when the crowd recoiled, when pity surfaced despite conditioning. Tacitus records that pity arose not because victims were innocent, but because their suffering seemed to serve the emperor's vanity more than the state. These flickers of conscience remind us that even in Rome, cruelty had limits. Still, damnatio ad bestias endured for centuries. It was cheap theatre for the state, a flexible canvas for myth, and an enduring reminder of imperial power. To die in the Colosseum was not only to be punished, it was to be written into Rome's theatre of control, where death itself was choreographed for applause. If Nero's games blurred myth into cruelty, then Trajan's games redefined excess itself. In the year 107 CE, the emperor celebrated his victory over the Dacians with a festival that seemed to stretch beyond human measure. For 123 consecutive days, Rome's Colosseum pulsed with blood and roared with applause. According to Cassius Dio and other chroniclers, over 11,000 animals and thousands of human beings, criminals, prisoners of war, condemned slaves, were slaughtered in a single festival cycle. The sheer scale defies modern comprehension. Imagine the logistics feeding lions and panthers brought from Africa, housing elephants from India, shipping crocodiles from the Nile. It was not simply a celebration. It was an empire flexing its muscle in theatre form, compressing the known world into a single arena where all of Rome could watch and cheer. The games were not random carnage. They were staged with precision, almost like a military campaign. Engineers had perfected the Hypogeum, a vast subterranean maze beneath the Colosseum. Here, 32 animal pens connected to 80 vertical shafts, each linked to trapdoors on the arena floor. At a signal, cages would rise, and beasts would burst forth as if conjured by the gods. The effect was magical and horrifying. Criminals never knew from which corner their death would arrive. Nor were these beasts ordinary. The scale of Trajan's triumph demanded novelty. Camels, ostriches, even rhinoceroses appeared bewildering spectators who had never glimpsed such creatures. Each animal was a living proof of Rome's dominion over distant lands. The empire was not just conquering territories, it was collecting their fauna, caging them, and parading them as trophies of victory. The condemned victims were woven into these pageants with theatrical flair. Some were armed, lightly told that survival meant freedom. But the odds were so stacked that such freedom was illusory. Others were forced into mythological roles, echoing Nero's style, but multiplied tenfold. A man might be dressed as Orpheus again, his lyre drowned out by the roar of lions. A woman might be arrayed as Pasiphae, only to be torn apart in parody of her mythical shame. Each reenactment was more grotesque than the last. The poet Martial, always quick with biting verse, commemorated these spectacles not in outrage, but in admiration. He described how the emperor could make fiction bleed into fact, how what had once been fable now unfolded under the open sky. His verses do not pity the condemned, they praise Rome's ingenuity. For him and many Romans, cruelty was proof of civilization's triumph, the ultimate expression of power. But power had a cost, one measured in coin as well as blood. Trajan's spectacles were enormously expensive. Feeding the beasts alone required staggering resources. Hunters, known as venatores, scoured the empire, risking their lives to capture creatures alive. They traversed the deserts of Africa, the forests of Germania, the mountains of Anatolia. Each animal represented not only an imperial conquest, but also a logistical miracle. Rome's roads, ports, and fleets all converged to supply the Colosseum. The games were empire distilled into blood-soaked theatre. For the populace, the games served multiple purposes. They distracted, entertained, and inspired awe. To sit in the stands was to participate in Rome's triumph. Bread was distributed to the hungry. Spectacle was distributed to the restless. The phrase, panem et circenses, bread and circuses, had never felt truer. Citizens might forget taxation, forget conscription, forget their own poverty. For a few hours each day, they were Rome masters of the world, spectators of its conquest. Yet, ancient writers hint that not all were pleased. Some senators muttered about the expense, about the waste of resources that might have been used to secure borders or repair infrastructure. Philosophers like Seneca, though he died decades earlier, had already laid the groundwork for critique. He warned that constant exposure to cruelty hardened hearts, making spectators greedy for pain. The games of Trajan, though celebrated, also haunted Rome's moral conscience. There is another layer of irony. Trajan remembered by later generations as Optimus Princeps. The best ruler was admired for his moderation in government, his administrative reforms, his expansion of the empire. Yet, his most enduring public spectacle was not moderation at all, but unrestrained excess. 11,000 animals, thousands of human corpses, the arena turned into a graveyard, disguised as a festival. It raises a troubling question. Could Roman greatness exist without Roman cruelty? Consider the silence of the victims. Few names survive. We know Martial's poetry, Cassius Dio's accounts, the imperial inscriptions. But the men and women thrown to beasts are nameless, erased. They were slaves, foreigners, criminals by decree. Their anonymity was part of the spectacle. They were not individuals, but fuel. Rome's glory was measured in their silence. And yet, archaeology whispers their presence. In the sands of the Colosseum, fragments of bone still surface, animal and human alike, mingled into one mass of remains. Inscriptions carved by spectators describe the thrill of watching beasts tear flesh. Reliefs on amphitheater walls show lions pinning men to the ground. In these artifacts, the cost of Trajan's victory still echoes. When we recall Trajan's triumph today, we often picture his column, the spiraling stone record of conquest in Dacia. But perhaps the truer monument is the Colosseum itself, its foundations soaked with blood, its stones haunted by screams. Victory was not only carved into marble, it was written into bodies, torn apart for applause. Rome called it a celebration. History reveals it as something darker, an empire rehearsing its power through death. The Dacians had been conquered on the battlefield. Their memory was conquered again in the arena where thousands of their kin perished anonymously. The games were not just about entertainment. They were about domination of enemies, of beasts of myth, even of morality itself. Trajan's triumph remains a lesson in scale. It shows how spectacle can mask horror, how power can disguise cruelty as celebration, how victory can be measured not only in borders gained, but in lives consumed. When the festival finally ended, the Colosseum floor was heaped with corpses. The empires might proven not by speeches or decrees, but by the silence of the dead. If the arena symbolized Rome's control over beasts and men, then fire symbolized its control over impurity. The Romans did not merely burn people alive to destroy them. They burned to purify, to cleanse what they believed polluted their world. In flames, law and ritual fused into one. The punishment of vivicomburium death by burning alive was one of the most feared penalties in the Roman imagination, reserved for crimes thought to taint the community. It carried religious significance beyond mere death. Fire was the element of the gods belonging to Vesta, guardian of the sacred flame and Vulcan, master of the forge. To be consumed by it was both terrifying and symbolic. The criminal's corruption dissolved in purifying heat. Among those who most dreaded this fate were the Vestal Virgins, Rome's sacred priestesses of Vesta. Sworn to 30 years of chastity, they embodied Rome's collective purity. Should they break their vow, it was not seen as a private failing, but as pollution endangering the city itself. Sometimes Vestals who erred were buried alive, an eerie form of execution without execution. But others accused of unchastity or betrayal faced death by fire. The contrast was deliberate. Earth swallowed the impure gently, but fire obliterated them with violence. Both rituals signaled that Rome would not tolerate divine offense. Arsonists, too, were subject to this fate, a poetic justice that matched crime to punishment. Fire used destructively must itself be met with fire. In this way, Roman law turned natural elements into instruments of moral balance. Yet, under Emperor Nero, burning became something else entirely. In 64 CE, the Great Fire of Rome raged for 6 days, reducing much of the city to ash. Rumors whispered that the emperor himself had ordered it, or at least let it spread, while he sang of Troy's destruction. To deflect suspicion, Nero found scapegoats: the Christians. Tacitus, in his Annals, records the horror that followed. These early Christians, already mistrusted for refusing Roman gods, were rounded up and condemned in grotesque new ways. Some were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified. But most infamously, many were coated in pitch or wax, mounted on stakes, and set alight to serve as torches in Nero's private gardens. The scene is almost unbearable. To imagine the emperor hosting evening banquets, while human beings burned like lamps, their screams mixing with the music of lyres and the laughter of guests. Nero, dressed as a charioteer, drove among them, turning execution into performance punishment, into parody of daylight. Even hardened Romans, accustomed to brutal games, recoiled. Tacitus noted that pity arose not because the victims were innocent, but because the cruelty seemed designed to satisfy one man's whim rather than the state's justice. Fire thus shifted from sacred purifier to imperial theatre. What had once cleansed pollution now broadcast tyranny. Nero's flames illuminated not only his gardens, but his cruelty. The irony is profound. The very element that symbolized Rome's eternal flame, Vesta's protection, became the tool of one emperor's debasement. But fire also fascinated the Roman imagination in subtler ways. The Stoic philosopher Seneca described fire as the ultimate metaphor for endurance. A flame, he said, cannot be harmed by wind. It grows stronger when tested. To Romans, steeped in Stoicism, being burned could be seen as the severest test of virtue. Accounts of martyrs, Christian, Jewish, or pagan, often emphasize dignity in flames, the condemned standing unbowed as their bodies blackened. For audiences, this endurance could transform horror into awe, cruelty into testimony. There are archaeological echoes of these punishments. Charred remains have been found in some amphitheatre soils, mingled with animal bones and ash. Inscriptions record arson cases where convicts were condemned ad flammas to the flames. and Roman writers like Pliny preserved stories of criminals punished with heated metal chairs or braziers pressed against their flesh, blending execution with ritual torture. The duality of fire, sacred and monstrous, mirrors the duality of Roman justice itself. To the Vestals, flames were eternal, nurturing Rome's destiny. To criminals, flames were annihilation, consuming body and identity. In both cases, Rome claimed mastery over the element, bending divine power into civic punishment. Yet, we must remember, for all its symbolism, fire was also spectacle. In amphitheaters, burning executions filled the midday slot between lighter shows and gladiatorial duels. Crowds roared not only at swordplay, but at the sight of bodies writhing in flame. The smell of burning flesh mingled with incense and roasted meats from vendors. What to us is horror was to them part of a day's entertainment. And in this lies Rome's paradox. Fire could sanctify or desecrate, purify or desecrate, cleanse or corrupt. It depended on who lit the match and why. Under Augustus, it reinforced moral law. Under Nero, it exposed tyranny. Always, it reminded Rome's citizens that their lives and their deaths were woven into the empire's theatre of control. When flames guttered out and ashes scattered, Rome's crowds went home entertained, and the empire endured another day. But the memory of those fires lingers, whispering that behind every torch was a body, and behind every festival was a funeral. Among Rome's most chilling punishments was not death by fire, nor by beast, nor by cross, but by silence. The Vestal Virgins. 6 priestesses charged with guarding the eternal flame of Vesta carried the symbolic life of the city in their care. As long as the flame in their temple burned, Rome itself was thought to endure. These women lived apart, honored with privileges that set them above ordinary citizens: the right to own property, to ride in carriages, to be seated at games beside the emperor. Their word could free prisoners and halt executions. But with privilege came peril. The price of breaking their vow of chastity was not trial or exile, it was the earth itself. The Romans believed that laying hands on a Vestal would pollute the city. They could not simply be executed. Instead, when one was accused of unchastity, she was condemned to a fate at once legal fiction and spiritual horror. She was buried alive. The ritual was elaborate. On the appointed day, the condemned Vestal was dressed in funeral robes and placed in a covered litter like a corpse already cut off from the living. In solemn procession, she was carried through the streets to a place just outside the city walls, the Campus Celeratus, the field of sin. Citizens watched in silence as the sacred priestess, once untouchable, was escorted like a ghost in daylight. At the site, a small underground chamber awaited, prepared with a lamp, a little food, and water. These provisions were not mercy, but a loophole. Technically, the Vestal was not being executed by the state, but merely placed in circumstances where she would die naturally. Rome preserved its purity while she perished in darkness. One of the most famous cases is that of Cornelia, the chief Vestal, condemned under Emperor Domitian in 91 CE. Ancient accounts tell us that as she was led to the chamber, her robe caught on the ladder. The executioner reached out to help her, but Cornelia drew back, refusing his touch, as if contact with him would pollute her final dignity. She descended alone. Pliny the Younger, who witnessed her burial, recorded her composure. She continued to call upon Vesta and the gods, declaring her innocence to the last moment. "Caesar thinks I am unchaste," she cried. "I, whose sacrifices he triumphed by." Then the chamber was sealed, earth piled above, and Rome's most sacred servant vanished into silence. Archaeology adds a grim echo. Excavations near the Colon Gate have uncovered chambers consistent with these descriptions. Narrow underground cells, some containing the skeletal remains of women, oil lamps, and broken vessels. These finds suggest that Cornelia's story was not unique, that several Vestals met the same fate entombed alive beneath Rome's soil. The symbolism of this punishment ran deep. Fire represented purity, earth represented contamination. To bury a Vestal was to remove pollution without spilling blood. Rome maintained the illusion of sacred law, even as it condemned its priestess to a lingering death. The city would not kill her, but it would wall her off from air sun and human company. For Romans, the death of a Vestal was both a warning and a ritual of control. It reminded the people that even the holiest could fall, that chastity and discipline were more than personal virtues. They were civic necessities. To falter was to endanger the state itself. By burying the priestess, Rome purified itself, sealing shame underground like a dangerous contagion. Writers of the time grappled with the horror. Some saw it as justice. Others whispered doubts, suspecting political motives. A Vestal could become inconvenient to an emperor or rival faction. Accusations of unchastity were nearly impossible to disprove. Her word weighed nothing against Rome's fear of divine anger. Thus, law and superstition mingled with politics, turning sacred duty into potential trap. To modern eyes, the punishment seems cruel beyond measure, not only in its mechanics, but in its psychology. Unlike crucifixion, which ended in hours or days' live burial, confronted its victim with prolonged solitude. In darkness, with only a lamp to remind her of lost light, the Vestal awaited suffocation or starvation. Unlike the spectacle of beasts or flames, this death unfolded unseen, hidden beneath the city that once revered her. The crowd might watch her, carried away, but no one watched her final breath. Her execution was not theatre, it was erasure. And yet, paradoxically, this silence echoed louder than spectacle. Stories of Cornelia's composure, of others' cries of innocence, circulated for generations. The fear of breaking vows grew sharper. The purity of the Vestals seemed more necessary precisely because its violation demanded such horror. Rome's greatness depended on symbols: the eagle of the legions, the laurel of victory, the flame of Vesta. By sealing a Vestal beneath the earth, Rome dramatized that its survival was worth any sacrifice, even the slow death of its most sacred women. Beneath the marble temples and triumphal arches, a darker truth smoldered, that the empire's eternity was secured not only by glory, but by graves. Rome's empire was built not only on conquest, but on discipline so unforgiving that soldiers feared their own comrades more than the enemy. In the legions, punishment was not a matter of abstract law, it was a matter of survival. And when discipline failed, the penalties were as theatrical and as brutal as anything in the arena. Two punishments in particular struck terror into the hearts of Roman soldiers: fustuarium, clubbing to death, and decimatio, the killing of every 10th man. Fustuarium was the legion's grim answer to cowardice, theft, or desertion. If a soldier abandoned his post, lost his weapon, or betrayed his comrades in battle, he could be brought before his unit. There, in full view of the men, he had failed the tribune or centurion would tap him lightly with a cudgel, a ritual gesture. At once the signal was understood. His comrades closed in with clubs and stones, beating him until his body was broken on the ground. The punishment was collective, not the state, but the legion itself carried out the sentence. The symbolism was sharp. The unit bound together in loyalty became the executioner. The condemned died, not as an enemy of Rome, but as a betrayer of his brothers. To participate in his death was to purify the group of shame. To refuse was itself dangerous. In this way, fustuarium reinforced solidarity through violence. The historian Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BCE, described the practice in chilling detail. He noted that even those who managed to escape were not truly saved. Their families dared not receive them. Their names were blotted out. Their dishonor was eternal. Fustuarium, then, was more than death. It was social annihilation. But when failure spread beyond an individual, when entire cohorts faltered, the Romans had an even more terrifying remedy: decimation. The word itself comes from decimus tenth. When a unit mutinied, deserted, or performed disgracefully, the soldiers were divided into groups of 10. Lots were drawn. The unlucky man in each group faced death, not from enemy swords, but from the clubs and stones of his 9 comrades. The survivors then suffered additional humiliation, reduced rations, forced to camp outside the fort, sometimes with barley instead of wheat. They lived in disgrace until blood had washed away their shame. The psychological terror of decimation was immense. Every soldier, no matter how innocent, had a 1 in 10 chance of death, and those spared had to execute their brothers. It was discipline by lottery, binding the legion in fear and guilt. As the military writer Vegetius later observed, it was not only the condemned who suffered, the whole unit carried the scars. Examples haunt the record. During the Third Servile War, after Spartacus humiliated Rome's armies, Marcus Licinius Crassus revived decimation against his own troops. One legion that had fled was punished. 500 men were clubbed to death by their comrades. The message was unmistakable. The shame of defeat would be erased in blood, even if the enemy stood at the gates. Later in 17 CE, the general Germanicus faced mutiny among his Rhine legions after Augustus's death. Desperate to restore order, he threatened decimation. The soldiers themselves, horrified, turned on their ringleaders and killed them to avoid the lottery. Fear of decimation accomplished what speeches could not. Not all emperors wielded the practice with restraint. Some used it to terrify their men into blind obedience. Under Augustus and Tiberius, threats of decimation hung constantly over the frontier armies. Even in the crisis of the 3rd century, emperors like Gallienus threatened whole units with the ancient punishment. Though rarely carried out at full scale, the threat was enough. It reminded soldiers that disloyalty to Rome could be punished as harshly as treason itself. There is a dark brilliance in these punishments. They turned justice inward, forcing comrades to kill comrades. They transformed guilt into cohesion. A soldier who had once hesitated on the battlefield now knew the stake's cowardice was not escape, but a slower, more shameful death at the hands of those who once shared his fire, his food, his laughter. Roman writers themselves were unsettled. Cicero hinted that such punishments, though effective, were barbaric in their cruelty. Yet, others like Livy praised them as the backbone of Rome's military discipline, proof that fear kept armies strong where love of glory might falter. And so fustuarium and decimation became grim rituals, executions staged not in amphitheatres, but in camps before marching standards and watchful gods. They were theatre for soldiers, reminding them that their lives belonged not only to Rome, but to each other. Imagine the scene, a legion drawn up in silence, the condemned dragged forward, the tap of a centurion's cudgel, the sudden thunderous descent of clubs, dust rising, blood soaking the ground. Then silence again, broken only by the order to march. Behind them, a comrade's body lay broken. Before them, the next battle loomed. And every soldier carried the memory that Rome demanded discipline, not as advice, but as death. If crucifixion was the most infamous Roman punishment, then crushing was its most spectacular. Sometimes the condemned were buried beneath stones, their ribs splintering under deliberate incremental weight. But the empire, ever hungry for novelty, discovered a more exotic tool of execution: the elephant. These beasts, captured in war and paraded in triumphs, became not only symbols of conquest, but instruments of annihilation. The practice had deep roots. Rome inherited the idea from its wars with Carthage and the East. To see an elephant in the flesh was already to witness empires reach. Africa and India collapsed into a single creature towering above men. To be killed by one was to be obliterated by the empire itself, crushed under the weight of its dominion. After the Punic Wars, stories spread of Carthaginian generals trampled beneath elephants as Roman vengeance. The symbolism was stark. The very animals once wielded against Rome now executed Rome's enemies. Defeat was doubled first in battle, then in humiliation. To the watching crowd, the message was clear. Rome not only conquered nations, it mastered the beasts that once terrified them. The Colosseum provided the perfect stage. Sources describe executions in which elephants were trained to step with agonizing precision. A handler's gesture could command the beast to pin a victim with its trunk, toss him into the air, then crush him slowly beneath its feet. Pliny the Elder, fascinated by animal intelligence, recorded how elephants could be taught to kill deliberately, breaking limbs one by one, prolonging agony while the crowd roared approval. Under Emperor Claudius, elephants were featured in special spectacles. Condemned criminals were armed with short spears or no weapons at all and forced to face the beasts. It was no contest. A single charge sent men flying, bones shattered on impact. Sometimes elephants were adorned with armor or painted in bright colors, turning execution into grotesque pageant. Claudius reportedly once pardoned a man when an elephant, recognizing its former keeper, refused to kill him and trumpeted in protest. The crowd, moved by this unexpected mercy, demanded the man's release. For a moment, the beast defied Rome's script, reminding all that even in the theatre of cruelty nature could speak. But such mercy was rare. More often, elephants became tools of collective punishment. During uprisings in the provinces, rebels and deserters were sometimes executed en masse beneath their trampling feet. Ancient accounts describe prisoners forced to kneel as elephants advanced their massive shadows, falling like doom. Some were crushed instantly, others lingered, bones broken, while the beasts were made to circle back. To the Romans, this was not merely brutality, it was order. The crushing of rebellion mirrored in the crushing of flesh. Symbolism ran deep. Stones or elephants denied victims not only life, but dignity. Crushing obliterated the body, leaving little for burial. In Roman thought, this was a punishment worse than death. It severed the condemned from the afterlife, leaving no remains for family rituals. To be crushed was to be erased. Anthropologists have noted that similar practices appear in other cultures in South Asia. Royal elephants executed criminals for centuries, trampling them in public squares. But in Rome, the act took on added weight. These were not native beasts, but imperial trophies, captured, transported, displayed. Their very presence in the arena testified to conquest. Their killing power dramatized empire's supremacy over man and nature alike. The scale could be staggering. During Trajan's reign after the Dacian Wars, exotic animals poured into Rome for months of spectacles. Ostriches, lions, leopards, even rhinoceroses shared the stage. Amid this menagerie, elephants stood apart. Their size alone dwarfed the condemned, turning human fragility into theatre. To watch a man disappear beneath an elephant's foot was to watch empire crush all who resisted. And yet, not all audiences responded with bloodlust. Some writers suggest unease. Seneca mused that to see beasts trained for cruelty was to see men's own corruption reflected back. Martial, ever the poet of the games, praised the ingenuity but hinted at unease. When myth became flesh and cruelty became art. The spectators, however, kept coming. For many, the horror was precisely the point. There is one more irony. Elephants' long symbols of wisdom and memory were made into agents of oblivion. They who never forget were forced to erase. Their weight was empire's judgment, their obedience Rome's law. In their footsteps, bones turned to dust and rebellion turned to warning. Archaeology offers faint traces. Reliefs carved on amphitheatre walls show elephants looming over fallen men. Inscriptions mention damnati ad bestias, the condemned to the beasts, a category that could include lions, bears, or elephants. Scattered bones, crushed and fragmented, suggest deaths too violent to preserve skeletons. The sand absorbed what the empire wished forgotten. Crushed by stones, trampled by elephants, the condemned did not merely die. They became symbols of empire's totality. To Rome, there could be no greater demonstration of power than to harness the largest beasts of earth and turn them into instruments of punishment. The audience cheered. The emperor nodded, and the arena floor darkened with yet another life extinguished. To be crushed was to vanish body and memory alike, leaving only the echo of Rome's triumph. Not every execution in Rome unfolded in the circus or amphitheatre. Some took place in the very heart of the city, within sight of the temples, the Senate, and the Forum. Here, punishment became not entertainment, but ritual. Rome reminding itself that treason carried a price measured in broken bodies. The site was the Tarpeian Rock, a cliff on the southern summit of the Capitoline Hill overlooking the Forum. To be thrown from it was not only to die, but to die before the eyes of gods and citizens alike. The legend of the rock begins with Tarpeia, a maiden who betrayed Rome to the Sabines. Promised what they wore on their arms, she expected gold bracelets. Instead, the Sabines crushed her beneath their shields, burying her under the weight of betrayal and irony. Her name became synonymous with treason, and the cliff where she died became Rome's place of execution for traitors. For centuries, ambitious men who overreached generals, who dreamed of kingship, and politicians who betrayed their oaths were marched to the edge of the Tarpeian Rock. From there, About 25 meters above the forum, they were cast onto the stones below. The symbolism was unmistakable. Rome did not kill its traitors in secret. It hurled them into public memory. One of the earliest victims was Spurius Cassius Consul in 486 BCE, accused of aspiring to monarchy. His death set the precedent. Anyone who reached too far, who threatened the fragile balance of the Republic, could be hurled from the cliff. Later came Manlius Capitolinus, once a hero who defended Rome from Gauls. Accused of seeking power for himself, he too was dragged to the rock. Imagine the scene: the man who once saved the city, now condemned as its betrayer, falling within sight of the very temples he had defended. His body shattered on the stones, his memory shattered in disgrace. The ritual carried both political and religious weight. To be executed on the Capitoline Hill was to be judged not only by men, but by gods. Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, whose great temple crowned the hill, loomed over the punishment. The message was clear. Treason was not only a crime against the state, but a sin against the divine order. The traitor was expelled not just from Rome, but from the cosmos of loyalty itself. The practice continued into the late Republic. In 86 BCE, during the bloody struggles between Marius and Sulla, the tribune Lucius Appuleius Saturninus was hurled from the rock after being accused of plotting tyranny. By then, the Tarpeian Rock had become less about law and more about political theatre. Accusations of treason could be wielded as weapons. Rivals branded as traitors were cast down to remind Rome that ambition beyond bounds was death. Writers like Juvenal later captured the irony the Tarpeian Rock was only a short walk from the capital itself. From the capital to the Tarpeian Rock, he quipped, is but a short step. In this phrase lies the essence of Roman politics. Honor and ruin lay side by side. One day, a man could be garlanded in triumph, the next, hurled to his death. The physical setting amplified the drama. The condemned was paraded through the forum, jeered by crowds stripped of insignia, then marched uphill. Every step was a reversal from the center of civic life to the edge of civic death. The cliff itself was bare, stark, unforgiving. There was no theatre, no spectacle, only a fall, a thud, and silence. Where crucifixion dragged death out for hours, the Tarpeian Rock offered sudden obliteration. Archaeological surveys of the Capitoline suggest that repeated executions left deposits of human remains at the base of the cliff. Later accounts describe the area becoming a place of dread, cleansed periodically to remove the stench of betrayal. Even in death, traitors were denied honor. Their bodies lay exposed, unburied carrion for birds and dogs. To Rome, this was fitting. Burial was for citizens in good standing. Traitors deserved only erasure. The symbolism endured long after the Republic fell. Emperors, though less inclined to use the Tarpeian Rock, invoked its memory. To mention it was to conjure Rome's harshest lesson. Loyalty was life. Ambition without sanction was ruin. Even centuries later, the phrase Tarpeian Rock lingered as a warning that power's summit was always shadowed by its edge. In this way, the rock embodied Rome's paradox. It celebrated civic virtue by destroying civic sinners. It dramatized law by hurling men beyond law. It was a stage without audience, a theatre where silence itself bore witness. And in its starkness, it revealed Rome's deepest truth, that glory and downfall were never far apart, that the city's survival demanded ritual sacrifices of those who reached too high. To walk the Capitoline today is to tread near that cliff where senators once stood, where bodies once fell. Tourists pass without pause, unaware that beneath their steps lies the memory of Rome's most symbolic graveyard. The Tarpeian Rock whispers still that ambition may raise a man to the Capitol, but treachery will cast him down. If one punishment has come to define Roman cruelty, it is crucifixion. The very word crux became a curse in Latin spat as an insult, abi, in malam crucem, go to a bad cross. It was not just death, it was humiliation, degradation, and erasure staged where as many eyes as possible could witness. For the Romans, crucifixion was not a punishment for citizens. It was reserved for slaves, rebels, pirates, and the most despised criminals. Its exclusion of citizens was deliberate. To nail a Roman to a cross would degrade the very dignity of citizenship. Instead, it was weaponized against outsiders and the lowborn, making clear the boundaries of Roman privilege. The process was designed for maximum suffering. The condemned was flogged, stripped, and forced to carry the horizontal beam of the cross, the patibulum, through public streets. Crowds jeered as he stumbled each step, announcing his fall from humanity. At the execution site, the beam was hoisted onto the upright stake. Nails or ropes secured wrists and ankles. There the victim hung suspended in agony. Death came not quickly, but over hours, even days from exhaustion, thirst, or suffocation. Roman executioners became specialists in prolonging torment. Some crosses included a small seat, the sedile, which prevented the body from collapsing and suffocating too soon. What looked like mercy was in fact cruelty, stretching life so suffering lingered. Seneca described seeing victims with heads forced down, others impaled, others with limbs grotesquely twisted. I see crosses, he wrote bitterly, not of one kind, but made in many different ways. No scene reveals the scale better than the aftermath of the Spartacus revolt. In 71 BCE, after Crassus defeated the slave army, 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way. Imagine it mile after mile of wooden crosses stretching from Capua to Rome, each bearing a writhing or rotting body. Travelers passing along that great road were forced to witness Rome's message. Rebellion meant not only death, but degradation. One body at a time turned into a milestone of terror. Even great men practiced it. Julius Caesar, once captured by pirates in his youth, returned later with a fleet and crucified them all. He ordered their throats cut first, a gesture of mercy, but the spectacle remained. To Rome, crucifixion was justice made visible, terror made lasting. And yet, there is a paradox. For all its horror, crucifixion also became theatre. The condemned hung exposed suffering under the gaze of strangers. His body was billboard and warning law written in flesh. The cross was spectacle, not in the amphitheatre, but in the streets and fields placed where it would sear memory into passers-by. It was also meant to deny dignity beyond death. Families were often forbidden to remove bodies. Corpses rotted on the wood carrion for birds, reminders of shame, long after life was gone. Proper burial, a cornerstone of Roman piety, was denied. In that denial lay the punishment's deepest cruelty, not only killing the body, but erasing the person from memory. And yet, crucifixion's very excess created its reversal. Among the thousands forgotten, one figure crucified under Rome would transform the meaning of the cross forever: Jesus of Nazareth. What Rome intended as humiliation became for his followers the symbol of triumph over death itself. The empire could nail flesh to wood, but it could not control how memory would evolve. In Christianity, Rome's ultimate punishment became the emblem of salvation, a reversal Rome never foresaw. This irony deepens our understanding of crucifixion. Rome intended it a spectacle of domination, the cross looming against the sky like a boundary marker of empire. Instead, history remembered it as a spectacle of resistance. The wood that bore slaves and rebels also bore a faith that would outlast the empire itself. For centuries, crucifixion remained Rome's grim punctuation mark, deployed on rebels, deserters, and nameless criminals. To stand at the roadside and see bodies stretched in agony was to see law, order, and fear carved into the landscape. It was Rome's most enduring performance of power. And yet, in the long arc of history, the cross speaks not of empire's strength, but of its inability to silence memory. Some Romans were not executed by beast fire or cross. Their punishment came after death, an execution of memory itself. The Senate called it damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, and it was one of the most terrifying fates imaginable. For a culture that believed immortality lay in remembrance to be erased was to die twice. When the decree was passed, a person's name was struck from inscriptions. Their statues were toppled, their faces chiseled away, their coins melted down. Public mention of their name could even become illegal. The punishment reached into every corner of life, blotting out legacy-severing ties with ancestors and descendants alike. It was not enough for the body to die. The identity had to vanish. The case of Domitian, assassinated in 96 CE, illustrates its power. Hated for cruelty and paranoia, he was erased with fury. His statues were smashed or recarved with new faces, his inscriptions scratched into silence. In the forum, fragments still bear the scars of chisels where his name once stood. The empire itself seemed to conspire to forget him. And yet, ironically, that very absence preserved his presence. To see a blank space where letters once carved Domitian is to be reminded of the man the Senate wished forgotten. Another victim was Commodus, the emperor, who fancied himself Hercules reborn. After his assassination in 192 CE, the Senate eagerly condemned him. His likeness was defaced, his memory cursed. But when Septimius Severus seized power, he reversed the decree, deified Commodus, and restored his image. In this reversal, we glimpse the political nature of memory erasure and restoration alike were tools of power. The fate of Sejanus, the Praetorian prefect under Tiberius, shows the punishment at its most thorough. After plotting to seize control, he was executed in 31 CE. His statues were torn down, his family destroyed, even his children executed. His name, once everywhere in Rome, became poison. Tacitus records that people spat at his memory, as though his very existence was a contagion. His statues were not merely toppled, but melted, transformed into effigies of despised figures. In trying to erase him, Rome made his downfall unforgettable. The paradox is striking. Damnatio memoriae did not always succeed in silence. Instead, it left absences so conspicuous that historians could not ignore them. Modern archaeologists can trace these erasures inscriptions where names were scraped away, but traces linger, reliefs where one face is crudely recut into another. The attempt to erase became in its own way a form of preservation. Romans feared this punishment deeply. A man could endure torture, even death, but to be forgotten, this was worse. The poet Horace had written, "Non omnis moriar." I shall not wholly die believing his verses would keep him alive in memory. Damnatio memoriae was the state's attempt to deny that hope. It said, "You will die wholly, as though you never were." Why did Rome invent such a fate? Partly because memory was power. To be remembered was to inspire loyalty, to command reverence, to leave descendants honored. To erase memory was to strip a family of prestige, to cut the thread of legacy. But it was also ritual. Rome believed in divine order, in ancestors watching the living. A traitor's memory threatened that order. Erasure was purification. And so damnatio memoriae became another form of spectacle, not of bodies, but of absence. Where once a statue of Domitian towered, now there was only rubble. Where once Sejanus's name adorned inscriptions, now there were scars. Citizens saw the void and understood. Rome did not merely kill traitors, it devoured their memory. In this way, Rome controlled time itself. Beasts and crosses managed bodies. Memory laws managed history. Both achieved the same end: deterrence. To betray Rome was to risk not only agony in life, but silence in eternity. And yet, across centuries, the condemned speak still. Their erasures are legible. Archaeologists decipher the scraped inscriptions, reconstruct the destroyed statues, and read the histories Rome tried to silence. Ironically, those who suffered damnatio memoriae endure better than many emperors praised in marble. Their absence became their legacy. Damnatio memoriae thus exposes the empire's most profound contradiction. Rome claimed eternity, yet feared memory's fragility. It tried to master both body and story, but in doing so revealed its limits. For memory cannot be wholly erased. It survives in scars, in whispers, in the stubborn curiosity of later ages. When you walk through the ruins of the Forum and see an inscription with a name gouged away, you see both Rome's power and its failure. You see how the empire tried to control not only life and death, but remembrance itself. And you see how even in absence, the condemned remain ghosts of history, erased and yet unerasable. As we reach the end of Rome's catalogue of punishments, one question lingers. What did all this cruelty mean? Was it mere bloodlust? Or was it something deeper? A philosophy of power, a way of shaping society through pain? For the Romans, punishment was never just about the individual. It was always about the collective. A crucifixion on the roadside warned thousands not to rebel. A decimation in camp welded soldiers together in terror. A Vestal's live burial purified the whole city. Law and ritual fused so completely that pain itself became a political instrument. Writers of the age grappled with this contradiction. Cicero, champion of republican ideals, insisted that punishment must reflect the majesty of law, not the anger of rulers. Yet, he also defended the Tarpeian rock as necessary for traitors, revealing the tension between justice and expedience. Tacitus, with his grim skepticism, wrote that cruelty often disguised itself as necessity, that emperors justified blood in the name of order. And Seneca the Stoic was most torn of all. He condemned the games, confessed that he left the amphitheatre more corrupt, yet continued to attend. He urged masters to treat slaves with mercy. They are men, yet lived in a society that whipped, branded, and crucified them daily. His philosophy recognized the humanity of the condemned, but his world demanded their dehumanization. This dissonance reveals the heart of Rome's philosophy of pain. To punish was to demonstrate control over rebels, over enemies, over the very fabric of life and death. But to watch punishment to cheer, it was to be shaped by cruelty to absorb its logic until it seemed natural. Juvenal's bread and circuses was not satire alone, it was diagnosis. The people fed grain and entertained with blood surrendered political voice for the narcotic of spectacle. And yet, cruelty was never random. It was highly codified, ritualized, steeped in meaning. The poena cullei, the sack with animals, dramatized betrayal of family. Burning alive purified the city from pollution. Crucifixion humiliated outsiders. Damnatio memoriae erased legacies. Each punishment was a symbol, a story told in flesh. The Romans, heirs to myth and ritual, turned executions into theatre of morality. What strikes us today is not only the brutality, but the self-awareness. Rome knew its punishments were performances. The Colosseum was not hidden. It was the largest building in the city. Executions were scheduled between comic skits and gladiator duels. Soldiers executed comrades in front of their entire cohort. Every act of pain was also an act of instruction. But instruction for what? For obedience, for awe, for the reminder that Rome's order was fragile and demanded constant reinforcement. In the end, cruelty was the tax of empire. It bought stability with blood. It bought loyalty with fear. There is irony here. Rome, that great architect of law roads and philosophy, trusted not only in reason, but in terror. Its jurists wrote elegant treatises on justice, while its arenas drowned in screams. Its poets exalted virtue, while its emperors lit gardens with burning men. Its philosophers sought self-mastery, while its generals lined roads with crosses. This contradiction is not a flaw of Rome. It is Rome. The marble arches and aqueducts stand because beneath them lay bones. And yet, we must not dismiss Rome as alien. Its legacy forces us to ask, what do our punishments say about us? We no longer crucify rebels or hurl traitors from cliffs, but prisons overflow, executions persist, and spectacle still distracts. Our circuses may be screens instead of arenas, but they too shape public appetite. Our laws still decide who suffers, who is silenced, who is remembered. Rome whispers that cruelty and control are never as distant from civilization as we imagine. Tacitus once wrote, "They make a desert and call it peace." So too, Rome made a theatre of pain and called it justice. And in that theatre, millions watched, learned, and consented. When we study these punishments, we study not only the empire, but ourselves. Because behind every flaming body, every broken slave, every name erased, lies the same human truth. Power fears rebellion, and fear breeds cruelty. Rome did not invent this. It only perfected it, staging pain until it became part of the civic heartbeat. When we walk today among the ruins, the arches, the Colosseum, the carved stones of the Forum, we see glory. But listen closely, and you may hear the echo beneath the roar of crowds, the crack of whips, the silence of those buried alive. Rome's greatness was real, so was its cruelty. The two cannot be separated. And when we reflect on their philosophy of pain, we confront our own. What will future generations see in our ruins? What stories will our punishments tell about us?